Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to another Resilient Hour from the Islamic Institute of Toronto. My name is Sakina Syed, and I am your host for today. For tonight, we have an interesting program with two prominent female Muslim scholars, mashallah, and for that, as a Muslim woman myself, I'm exceptionally proud. But first, before we get to that, we will begin with the recitation of the Quran by Hafiz Sabiq Khadim.
السلام عليكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وما خلقنا السماوات والأرض وما بينهما إلا بالحق وإن الساعة لآتية فاصفح الصفح الجميل إن ربك هو الخلاق العليم ولقد آتيناك سبعا من المثاني والقرآن العظيم لا تمدن عينيك إلى ما متعنا به أزواجا منهم ولا تحزن عليهم واخفض جناحك للمؤمنين وقل إني أنا النذير المبين كما أنزلنا على المقتسمين الذين جعلوا القرآن عضين فوربك لنسألنهم أجمعين عما كانوا يعملون فاصدع بما تؤمر وأعرض عن المشركين إنا كفيناك المستهزئين الذين يجعلون مع الله إلها آخر فسوف يعلمون ولقد نعلم أنك يضيق صدرك بما يقولون فسبح بحمد ربك وكن من الساجدين واعبد ربك حتى يأتيك اليقين صدق الله العظيم.
I'm so sorry, I was just muted. But Jazakallah khair, Brother Sabik. Sabik is a student at GLA and a Hafiz, and he has grown up at IIT, where both of his parents and his family are active members. Today's topic, finding peace in the Quran. In a world of personal, community, and global turmoil, we as Muslims turn to the Quran for guidance and solace. The format for today's program will be a little bit different. Taking the situation in context, Dr. Julie Lowe and Dr. Kathy Bullock will engage in a discussion about how the Quran, approached in the right way, can bring comfort to the believers and indeed be a source of peace for mankind. Both of these scholars have graduated from the University of Toronto, and both of them are in their own right scholars of Islam. Dr. Kathy teaches at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and is the author of Muslim Women, Rethinking the Veil. And Dr. Lowe has a PhD in Islamic law and actively pursues her interest in studying the Quran. She has met the science of its recitation and has received ijaza in various riwayah. Without further ado, I will take a step back and invite both Dr. Kathy and Dr. Julie Lowe to discuss this topic, beginning with Dr. Bullock. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakina. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Julia, and everyone watching at AAT. It's nice to be with you again.
Wa alaikum assalam.
We have been asked to have a conversation about the meaning of peace in the Quran. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Julie, if you wanted just to get the ball rolling, why do you think the topic of peace in the Quran is important?
Right. So when we're looking at this topic of peace in the Quran or peace with the Quran, There's, of course, two elements to this. We have the element of peace or salam, and we have the Quran. And both of these elements are quite important to us as Muslims. So, of course, in combination, they're going to also be very important. If we just look briefly at the concept of peace or salam, we find actually that the Quran mentions peace multiple times in different contexts, which gives us an idea of how important it is. For example, one verse in the Quran, it says, وَإِذَا جَاءَكَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِآيَاتِنَا فَقُلْ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكُمْ. That when those who believe in our verses come to you, say Salamun alaikum. And we know that when we greet other Muslims, we greet them with peace, right? With Assalamu alaikum. Similarly, in the Quran, the greeting of the people of paradise, tahiyyatuhum fiha salam. Their greeting in paradise is salam. In fact, salam or peace is one of the names of paradise, Darus Salam. And one of the names of Allah, which is also mentioned in the Quran, is As-Salam, or we can maybe translate that loosely as the one who gives peace, the bestower of peace. As for the Quran, of course, the Quran is the speech of Allah. It's His direct speech to us. It's a book that, as Muslims, is meant to guide us and inform every aspect of our lives. So peace is very important. The Quran is very important, and therefore finding peace in the Quran is important. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes for many of us, perhaps our peace with the Quran, it might be there to an extent, but is somewhat lacking. For example, the Quran might be placed on the top shelf of somebody's bookshelf out of respect, but there's not really a substantial connection with it. So I hope that inshallah tonight we can start looking at how to change that. What about yourself, Kathy? What's your take on this topic?
I think about, because I'm a political scientist, I think about the political ramifications of answering this question. And then I also think as a person, a human being, what are the spiritual ramifications? And I think that the concept of peace exists at many levels. So the first one is the individual level, and then there's peace in the family, and then there's peace in society and international relations. When I think about peace in the Quran, I believe that the Quran speaks to each one of those dimensions of our existence. And so I just found a few verses that I wanted to share with people. The first one is, if I just focus on the spiritual, which is the individual person. I actually interviewed a convert last week about what drew her to Islam. And she said she didn't know much about Muslims or Islam, and she was attracted by somebody who she thought had a sense of inner peace. And she asked a friend, oh, like this person, what is it? And then she found out they're Muslim. So she's like, oh, what's that? I want to have it for myself. When she told me that story, I actually remembered something similar when I first met Muslims in Kingston, which is a very long time ago now, 1994. I was an atheist at the time. But there was something about these people that I met at the International Student Center, some kind of calm that was very intriguing, very, very intriguing. It didn't necessarily make me study Islam at the time, but it was definitely always there in my mind. The verse that comes to my mind the most is the one in Surah Arad 13:28, which says, verily in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. And I found different translations of that final word. So verily in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest, or comfort, or peace and satisfaction. Verily in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find satisfaction. And when we ask ourselves what we're seeking in life, everybody wants that sense of inner satisfaction. What are the synonyms for inner satisfaction? I looked it up in the dictionary. So serenity, tranquility, calmness, freedom from disturbance, freedom from annoyance, freedom from distraction or anxiety or obsession. So what can the Quran do to bring that calmness to our heart? That's what I wanted to emphasize. I have other verses that I want to share about the relationship between the self and the family and society, but maybe I can stop talking and we can draw that out as the evening goes by. You mentioned a relationship between the peace and the Quran. So, without maybe getting too personal, but if you want to share, like, how do you find peace with the Quran on a personal, individual level?
Right. So there's a few things that I think I find helpful for finding peace with the Quran, and probably many more that we don't have time to delve into tonight. But one thing is just understanding the place of the Quran and the attributes of the Quran. Understanding, for example, that the Quran is intended as a book of guidance. So Allah says, for example, كتاب أنزلناه إليك لتخرج الناس من الظلمات إلى النور بإذن ربهم. That this is a book that we revealed to you to bring people out of darkness and into the light. And the fact, for example, that the Quran is described itself as light. And when you start to understand the purpose of the Quran and the status of the Quran, to me, this is very helpful for finding peace in the Quran because it makes you want to develop a connection with it. That's kind of at an intellectual level. In terms of day-to-day practice, one thing that's very important for me personally is reciting the Quran. And for our audience who knows me as a Quran teacher at IIT, a Tajweed teacher, I don't think that's going to come as a huge surprise. But when you're reciting the Quran, you're reciting the speech of Allah. And this is something that should bring peace. In fact, it's mentioned in hadith. So there's a very famous hadith of the otorojja, or like the citrus fruit, which basically says that the example of the believer who recites the Quran is like a citrus fruit, that they smell good and they taste good. And the hadith continues that the example of a believer who does not recite the Quran is like a date. It tastes good, but it doesn't have a smell. And the idea is that, of course, in both cases, it's a believer, right? It's somebody who believes in the Quran. It's somebody who is acting on the Quran. But recitation, when you also recite the Quran, it has like almost a status over the believer who doesn't. It produces this good smell. And I think in the context of our discussion, you can say that that is an extra connection that you have with Allah through the Quran, and something that leads to peace. Maybe some people in our audience here are saying, well, you're a Tajweed teacher, you like reciting the Quran, but what about me? I can barely, I stumble through the verses when I recite it and so forth. And there's actually another interesting hadith that I often tell my students, which says, al-mahiru bil-Qur'ani ma'a safaratil kiramil barara, that the one who is skillful at the recitation of the Quran is with the noble angels. So again, the idea of bringing peace, if you're with the noble angels because you're skillful at the recitation, you recite it fluently, of course, that's going to bring peace if your status or your level at that point is with the noble angels. But the hadith continues, وَالَّذِي يَقْرَأُ الْقُرْآنَ وَيَتَتَعْتَعُ فِيهِ وَهُوَ عَلَيْهِ شَاقٌّ لَهُ أَجْرَانِ, that the one who stutters and stumbles through the recitation and finds it difficult, that person has 2 rewards, meaning they're being rewarded for their effort as well as for their recitation. So, of course, sometimes this hadith is mistranslated. It doesn't mean that person's getting more reward than the one with the noble angels, but the point is that you're still getting rewarded and you can still build that connection with Allah and with the Quran, even if you're stumbling a bit and finding it a little bit difficult when you recite. And for those who find that even too much, you can listen to recitation, right? Just listening to the recitation of the Quran is something that also brings peace. So if you're not able to recite, then that's something else that you can do. Another, and this is the last main point that I'll mention before turning it back to you, Kathy, but one thing that's also very important for me that has brought me peace with the Quran is its memorization. Because when you memorize the Quran, you internalize it in a way where it's always with you. And that, I think, brings peace. But when we're dealing with memorization of the Quran, again, for those who are like, this is just too much, memorizing the whole thing, you don't have to set out to memorize the whole thing to obtain some sort of benefit from this and to obtain peace from it. So even memorizing, a new small surah or a few verses is something that will allow you to internalize a part of the Quran and hopefully derive peace from that. And a secondary benefit, of course, because we recite the Quran in our prayer, I think sometimes we get very mechanical, right? We recite the same small things over and over again, and we don't really think about it. We just do it out of habit. So if you take it upon yourself to memorize even something small that's new, it often forces you to concentrate a little bit more in your prayer because you're not just doing the same thing over and over again, but it increases your connection with your prayer and with Allah and with the Quran. So those are a few things that for me personally are quite important: the recitation, memorization, and just understanding the purpose, the status of the Quran. How about yourself?
As you're talking, my mind is going off in so many different directions. It reminds me actually, even in English, see the those of us who don't understand the Arabic and have to read in translation, even in the English, you can get satisfaction in the heart because it speaks to the intellect in a way. It speaks to you what do you need. And it reminds me of a story that I've told many times. I don't know how many people here have ever heard me tell this story, but when I first read the Quran, actually I was an atheist. And this was at the time of the Gulf War in 1991. And the US had invaded, and they had on the TV all these images of the Arab men with their beards, little Qurans, guns, burning the US flag. And it looked horrible. So I asked someone at my university, I was an undergrad, if I could borrow a copy of the Quran. I just happened to know one or two Muslims. And she lent me this Quran, which I read maybe, I don't know, the first couple of chapters. And it was a translation it's the Abri translation. So he organizes it in order of length, I think, not in order of, not, no, that's in order of revelation. I can't remember. But anyway, there's something weird about it. So it was actually a horrible book. I didn't even finish. I was like, oh my God, no wonder these Muslims are so violent. Because all I saw were the verses about fire and brimstone and God punishing the unbelievers and burning and, sending them all this. And so I wrote in my diary, oh, the God of Islam is a very vengeful God. And then a few years later, when I, met Muslims and challenged them and went on that great spiritual journey that with me converting in 1994, when I approached the Quran again as a believer, I saw something completely different. And it spoke to my soul, I suppose. It was speaking to my soul. I can remember one time driving down the highway here in Toronto. I was running late. I got stuck in a traffic jam, and it was sunset, and I had the Quran on, and I just felt like my heart was being opened and honey was being poured in. It was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had. So those are the things that come to my mind when you were talking. A lot of English-speaking people find the Quran very weird. It's one of the famous quotes that I like to read from a Scottish philosopher called Carlyle in 1840. He wrote this. He wrote, "The Quran is a toilsome reading. It's wearisome. It's a confused jumble, incondite, and insupportable stupidity." But what I've learned from reading the Quran, I try to just dip, even if it's just Sheikh Abdullah once taught us, even if you just crack the cover and read one verse, try to do that every day. That what happens is you get the message, no matter how much you dip in and out of, no matter where you are in the Quran, you're getting the main message. And that's really, really beautiful. There's one God. There'll be a day of judgment. Be a good person. It's so no matter how much you dip and grab, you're always getting the main message. And for me, that's something that people who are looking for a book that starts with a narrative A to B, they don't find that. And that's why they get confused. I guess I'll stop there. But there's one more thing I want to say here. I think that if we talk about how can the Quran bring peace to human beings, I think it's because it's our own little support group. It's a cheerleading group for us. And there are so many verses that are basically consoling and helping. I just want to share a couple that I was looking at today. It basically says, don't worry. If you slip up, if you make a mistake, God will forgive you. Just try to be good. Try good again, and God will forgive you, but don't give up. So in Surah Nisa, chapter 499, it's talking to the oppressed peoples. There is hope that Allah will forgive, for Allah does blot out sins and forgive again and again. Blot out sin and forgive again and again. I mean, that's such a beautiful message because we're always doing wrong things. Or another one in Surah Ali Imran 115, of the good that they do, meaning believers or people, nothing will be rejected of them, for Allah knows well those who do right. So nothing that you do, and I'm sure you all, this is bringing to your mind the more famous one from Surah Al-Zalzala 99, verse 7. So whoever does an atom's weight of good will see it. So those times when we're feeling down or depressed or anxious or whatever, and you say to yourself, this is what I do. I say to myself, an atom's weight of good, Allah will see it. That's just so inspiring. It's very encouraging. What resonates in your mind while I'm talking?
I know I found it interesting actually that you mentioned that a lot of English speaking people find the Quran weird. I never quite thought of it in that way, but it's true. I mean, it sounds like you're saying almost that if you focus on the message of the Quran, like you can get past that, or what would your advice be, like concise advice to somebody who picks up a translation of the Quran and they find it weird because they're looking for a narrative, so as to speak, from start to finish?
I would say look for the message that's speaking to what you feel that you need that day.
Okay, fair enough.
Do you ever think of the difference between peace with the Quran or peace with Islam?
Yeah, so I think a question like this, trying to distinguish between peace with the Quran and peace with Islam, is perhaps belying the fact that both of us are academics and are trying to make distinctions like this, but that's okay. If we just deal with, first of all, what is the Quran and what is Islam, if we're going to distinguish between them, of course, the Quran is the book of Allah. It is what Islam is based on. So it's a huge part of Islam, but perhaps we can say that Islam as a whole is a little bit broader than the Quran. Even though the Quran is a major part, Islam includes, for example, the Hadith as source text. So it has certain things in addition to the Quran, even though the Quran is a major part. So is there a difference? Can somebody find peace with the Quran and not peace with Islam, or vice versa? I think if somebody is completely not at peace with the Quran, they're not going to be at peace with Islam, because given how important a role the Quran plays, if somebody has an adversarial relationship with the Quran, then chances are they're going to have an adversarial relationship with Islam. Conversely, if somebody is completely at peace with Islam, they're likely going to be at peace to a certain extent with the Quran, again, because of the intimate relationship between the two. That being said, can they diverge? Perhaps. So, for example, if somebody is struggling with a hadith, so somebody comes across, I don't want to raise too much controversy here, but say a hadith like the one that a people won't prosper who appoint a woman over as their ruler. This hadith has been interpreted in different ways, but someone comes across an interpretation that they find difficult, and that causes them to experience some sort of inner conflict. In this case, if the person is fine with everything in the Quran and is just kind of questioning a hadith, in a sense, they're at peace with the Quran, but they have, something that's causing them a little bit of a disturbance with the religion in general. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in a case like that. But perhaps more importantly, I think if we're going to deal with this topic of peace with the Quran and peace with Islam, it bears mentioning that, peace is not necessarily a binary, right? It's not something that you have to have at 100 or 0. This isn't a light bulb that you turn on and off. We're humans with complex emotions. Peace is something that you can feel at different levels on a spectrum. And because of this, if somebody is a Muslim who believes in Allah and they pray 5 times a day and they're very happy with Islam generally, but say that person also falls under the category that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion this evening, where the Quran just sits on, the highest shelf in their room out of respect, but they're not really engaging with it. In a case like that, I would say that somebody maybe has a high level of peace with Islam generally, but their peace with the Quran, it's there, but it's lacking. Like, it's not at as good a level as it should be. So there's a bit of a disconnect, even though there's a level of peace with both. And in a case like this, of course, this is normal, but the person needs to work on their peace with the Quran to bring that up to a better level, inshallah. So I don't know. This is, of course, there's a level of semantics in a discussion like this. It's not necessarily right or wrong, but those are a few thoughts that I have. I'm not sure about yourself.
I don't know. When I first thought of this question, I was just remembering, obviously, the Quran was what helped me become Muslim. In fact, it was the thing eventually, the message. But I was very out of sorts with a lot of the things that I thought Islam taught about women, women's role and things like that in society, and certain verses about women. And it took me actually around 8 years of searching to finally come to peace with all of those aspects about women and Islam. So when I was first thinking about that question, I was thinking, well, yeah, you can be at peace with the Quran, like between you and the Quran, but the wider issues of the community and women's role, or other. I mean, there are always issues, right? After I solved the women and Islam thing, took me 8 years. Then I moved on to other issues. So there's always some issue. But as you just said, it's maybe a little bit semantics because there's no Islam without the Quran, and it's the relationship between perhaps what we talk about in academia between text and context, or the text and how it's interpreted, like the various interpretations. And so if we want to put all the various interpretations, the different schools of law, all of that into the world of Islam, and then we have the Quran, which is the text. And so you might have issue with interpretations, but not necessarily with the text. I think that's how I was thinking of it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And of course, you can define Islam slightly differently depending on, like you said, what you want to put in it, because we have a whole tradition, but that tradition goes beyond the basic text. There's people's understandings of it, which sometimes have evolved over time and which are sometimes a little bit different depending on the society and the culture and the era and so forth.
So I think they want us to wrap up our conversation within about 5 minutes so that we can take questions. But you mentioned if someone's struggling with a hadith, and you just gave a couple of tips. Do you want to share more details about how you think people can deal if they're struggling with a verse or a hadith or something?
Yeah, I mean, so if somebody is struggling to find peace with the Quran generally, there's general tips for that, which I don't think is what you're asking about now. So things like I mentioned earlier, like increasing your recitation of the Quran and so forth. I don't think that's what you're getting at here. If you are struggling specifically with, let's say, the gender issue, right? That's a hot topic in our times. A few things. One, again, like was mentioned before, pieces of degrees, or at least that's my opinion. So just because you haven't achieved 100%, don't let that discourage you. It doesn't mean that you don't have any peace with the Quran or that you're a bad Muslim. Um, sorry, there's a lot of
Who's got the background noise happening?
don't know. Let's keep going. There seems to be some background noise on the call, but that's fine. If you're struggling to find peace with one of these hot issues like gender, one thing. So I've actually taught a course on Islam and gender, by the way, last in the fall semester, which was an interesting experience. One thing that I always advise is, first of all, ask somebody who is appropriate to guide you through something like this. That means somebody who you trust, right? Who you're able to talk to and not worry about, them judging you, this sort of thing. Also, somebody who has knowledge, of course, and somebody who is aware of your own context, like your cultural context, because there are certain issues where there's room for interpretation. I'm not saying that's limitless, but there certainly for issues like gender and whatnot, and a lot of these quote unquote controversial issues. And what happens sometimes, unfortunately, is people take a fatwa from some random country overseas that's quite conservative, and that does not fit well with the context here or wherever the person is located. But that's not necessarily the only way of looking at the issue. So it's very important that you seek advice from somebody who not only knows the Quran and knows Islam and who you trust, but who also is, who can answer the question in a way that takes into account, the culture and the time that you live in an appropriate manner. It doesn't mean that everything can be interpreted in endless ways, but that there is a range. As well, don't get tunnel vision. So sometimes when we're looking at something that maybe, some particular issue we're struggling with, sometimes that's the only thing that we spend our time on, and that's definitely a mistake. The Quran, for example, just taking the gender issue again, the Quran is not a book about gender. Of course, it is part of Islam, and I'm not saying it's not important. These things do need to be discussed, but there are much broader messages that should be taking up a lot of our attention as well. Things like Tawheed, right? Like worshiping Allah. Don't let one little thing distract you from everything else and from finding peace with the Quran, with all these much broader things about worshiping Allah and all, the main message of Islam. And as well, you can work on general areas that connect you to Allah, like making dua, like your prayer and so forth. Not, again, this kind of goes back to not everything turns on this one little thing that is bothering you. So don't get sidetracked just by that. Those are a few suggestions I have. Yourself, Dr. Kathy.
I think those are fantastic. I had a list of 6 things, and what you said is in my list. I'll just add then a couple of things that you didn't mention. The first one this is the first thing that I've always done when I come across an issue that I've been struggling with, and that's just to remember the best about God, to think of Him in the best of ways, that He created human beings in the best of molds. It says in the Quran 95:4, He created us in the best of molds, and that He intends ease for us. The very beautiful verse 2:185. Allah intends for you ease and does not intend for you hardship. So if you're struggling, this is a way related to what you said about tunnel vision. You're struggling with that one thing, but just remember, Allah created you in the best of mold. He intends the best for you, and we know that difficulties are normal. It's normal this is not paradise. We shouldn't expect easy things. There's a verse that says we have created humanity into toil and struggle. That's in chapter 90, verse 4. So as I'm going through this thing, I'm thinking, okay, I'm struggling with this, but we're meant to have difficulties in our life. God intends ease for us. So you have to do the interpretation of, give it the best reading. Give it the best reading that you can, that shows how it can relate ease to you. And that, as exactly what you said, to keep practicing while you're struggling with that verse or that issue, because well, you have to be patient for wisdom to come. It took me 8 years. I'm not saying I'm a model or anything, but I'm just saying that I understand now, looking back, that it took me 8 years. So in the meantime, keep praying, keep the 5 daily prayers, keep the Ramadan while you wait, and just know that eventually you'll get some kind of answer that's full of wisdom. We know that the hadith says the first action on the day of judgment that will be looked at is our prayer. So even while we're struggling with those issues, just like stick to the basics. That's what I've always told myself, and I guess that's how I feel like I've survived. Like the first year after I converted, it was a very, very difficult year. If I hadn't had some of these mechanisms in place, including the ones you mentioned about seeking advice from good people, I'm not sure I would have survived. So those are the tools that I've turned to over the years.
Yeah, I think maybe we can add to that, and just you mentioned again seeking advice and that you had good people. Also, just surrounding yourself with good company. And if you don't have good company, seeking it out. So that can be something like just enrolling in an Islamic class, right? Where you're going to find like minded people who are also interested in Islam, and, who you can become friends with and who can support you. Having that support network is really important.
That's so true. Now, I believe that they want us to turn it over to the moderator now for questions.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you so much, Dr. Kathy and Dr. Julie, for taking the time to share those insights with us. I know that I absolutely learned so much, and I have been taking notes from this conversation. So, thank you. I just I'll mention a little bit more of the takeaways at the end, but just to move on to the questions quickly. The first question that I have is both of you have talked about some of the different ways that we can find peace in different aspects of the meaning of the Quran, and something that I've been aware of is that a lot of people have experienced learning the recitation of the Quran, perhaps in classes, maybe the tajweed of the Quran, and then they have experience learning about the meaning or the tafsir in classes. But many people don't actually delve into the meaning of the Quran themselves. It can be intimidating to try and explore the meaning of the Quran themselves. So I was wondering if you had any advice or recommendations for people who would like to explore the meaning of the Quran as much as they recite the words of the Quran.
Yeah, so I can mention a few things on this point. One is when we're dealing with the meaning of the Quran, you don't have to crack open a huge book of tafsir. Even opening a translation, if you don't understand the Arabic directly, is a means of engaging with the meaning. So you can even buy mushaf that have the Arabic on one side and the English or whatever language on another side. That's a great way to go through it if you want to do both. YouTube, something like that, is a great source for relatively, bite-sized chunks of tafsir. Again, that's not overly intimidating, but you can learn a lot from something like that. So it doesn't have to be like, either a giant tafsir or attending a class, in a masjid, or just reciting. Other things that can help. One thing is interacting with the Quran, which is perhaps a little bit different, but somewhat on this topic. When we recite the Quran, sometimes we do it very mechanically. But, when the idea is when you're reciting the Quran, say you recite a verse of Jannah, ask Allah for Jannah, make dua for that. When you recite a verse of Jahannam, seek refuge from that. So even interacting in this manner is a way of engaging in the meaning to some extent. When you're reciting, that doesn't require scholarship, right? You don't need scholarship to pay attention to when you're reciting a verse of Jannah and to interact with that. So these are a few things that you can do. Also consider, like, even just, if you're reading a translation, just writing a few reflections or sharing those reflections with friends. All of these things are very easy to do at home.
Thank you so much for sharing those different ways that we can sort of delve into the Quran. Another question that I had from, I think it was touched upon a little bit, but I wanted to ask in greater detail to both of you is with the something that was mentioned in the introduction of this talk was the context for this. So, being in a time of great global turmoil and personal turmoil for a lot of people, and I know a lot of people deal with guilt or a worry about how much they're able to interact with the Quran or how much they're able to incorporate the Quran into the meaning and the recitation of the Quran into their lives. So I was wondering if we could get some advice or insights on the different ways that we can make Quran a more holistic part of our lives.
Kathy, would you like to start, or should I take this?
I can start, and then you can add. This is what I said in when I was talking. I got this from Sheikh Abdullah. Even if you just crack the cover and read one verse, we know that Allah likes the good deeds done continuously, even if they're small. So I think for someone who is newly starting with that idea, it's like exercising when you're unfit. You just start with something small. When you're really, really unfit, you start maybe with 5 minutes a day on the treadmill or 5 minutes walk. And then as you get used to that, you increase. So I would just suggest to start a habit of reading one verse a day and then reflecting on it. And then once you feel that you can do more than 2 verses a day, one of the mistakes that a lot of converts do, they say that they say their shahada, they become Muslim, then they do all 5 prayers, all the voluntary prayers. They try to read like 1/30th of the Quran every day. They try to fast every Monday and Thursday, and after a couple of months, they're like in shock. They're like burnt out, and then they'll stop and maybe not do anything because it's been like they've gone from nothing to sort of swimming in the deep end. But it doesn't work like that. It's like stamina you build up slowly. So for someone, I'm just going to repeat myself as a sum. So for someone who's beginning this new, I would just say one verse a day until you feel you can increase it to 2, until you can increase it to 3, and then like that.
Yeah, I was going to mention a lot of the same thing in terms of picking a manageable goal and also having a routine. A routine, like you were talking about every day, is quite important because once you build up a routine, it becomes habit, right? Whereas if you're trying to, like, one day you do, an hour, and the next day you do nothing, and then the next day it's like 5 minutes and everything's just all over the place, that often, people tend to just leave things to the side. But if you get into a routine of where you're doing something for 5-10 minutes a day, it becomes a routine and it's much easier to maintain. We see, speaking of routine and setting manageable goals, in Ramadan, we have this thing, Ramadan fatigue, right? People set these huge lists at the beginning of the month and then they very quickly give up on it. And by the end of Ramadan, they haven't really done much on it because they've bit off more than they can chew. So it's very important to set a manageable goal for yourself and realize it doesn't have to be in Ramadan. You can, if you want to finish the Quran, whether you want to finish reciting in Arabic, whether you want to finish, reading the translation in English or whatever, this can be a year-long thing. Like, don't think that you have to do X and such in Ramadan and then outside that, it's too late. No, feel free to set yourself a goal of, during this entire year, I'm going to gradually read through the Quran with the goal of finishing in a year or even 2 years. That's fine. But you'll feel much more motivated if you set something that's actually attainable for yourself and work towards that instead of just, taking something that's not manageable. Another thing, we've been mentioning recitation and translation. There, you can set other types of goals as well. So, of course, acting on the Quran is very important. That goes without saying. And there's a lot of small things that we can do as a routine or, things that we can add that are not super time consuming. Something like charity, right? Charity is mentioned in the Quran. If you set up a recurring donation or something for a cause that you want to support, that is a way that you're interacting with the Quran and hopefully building peace with the Quran and doing something a little bit extra that's encouraged in it. Or adding, say, one sunnah prayer that you don't currently do. Again, it's like less than 5 minutes out of your day, but it's something that you can, that's encouraged by the Quran and will help build your relationship with it without overwhelming you. So, yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Sakina.
For sharing that. I love the two things. I love the analogy of building up your spiritual muscle as similar to exercise that Dr. Kathy mentioned, because that is such a good, an amazing point that it's not something that you maybe can build those habits all at once, and then it is definitely very easy to feel discouraged if you can't, flex that spiritual muscle to the extent that you might want. So, consistent and sustainable practice and building that up. Thank you for mentioning that. And Dr. Julie, the idea of incorporating acting on the Quran as part of interacting with the Quran, I think, for me, when I immediately think of my relationship with the Quran, I almost consider actions to be separate. But it's really beautiful to think about the ways that we can connect those two things and add that intentionality. So thank you for that. Um, I think we have time for one last question before 8:05. So this question will be for both of you, but I'll just ask the question. So it was noted at the beginning, I think, that mashallah, we have two female scholars with us today, both of you. And for me, growing up, for example, I was often, I don't think that these are religious beliefs, but I think I often saw Islamic scholarship and Islamic interactions with the Quran as more male led. And there was, I think, when I was growing up, perhaps an absence of role models in that area. So I was wondering if both of you have advice for our young sisters who are also very inspired by the recitation of the Quran and the analysis of the Quran, and maybe have felt discouraged by a lack of representation in those spaces. Perhaps I can start with Dr. Kathy, and then we can move to Dr. Julie.
You want to, sorry, could you just repeat the question?
If you had any advice for our young sisters who perhaps have seen a lack of representation or felt discouraged regarding the study of the Quran or the recitation of the Quran, but would like to get involved and pursue that.
Islam has a great tradition of female scholarship that's been lost over the years. I think I would suggest two things. And the first one is going to seem irrelevant, but just be a little bit patient while I mention it. When I first became Muslim, I sometimes felt that the Quran was speaking to men, and I felt a bit discouraged. And then I heard that story of I think it was Salama, and she said something exact to the Prophet, peace be upon him. The Quran speaks to men, what about us women? And then that verse was revealed for believing men and women, for Muslim men and women, for peaceful men and women, for charitable men and women. I don't memorize it, but it's like really long. For men and women, men and women, men and women, men and women, men and women. And that was like the answer to that question. The Quran speaks to men and it speaks to women. When I give talks to church groups and I show this verse, I always say this is not a politically correct translation. This is in the original Arabic. And the Quran says that believers, men and women, are protected one of another. So we have to know that it's not, even if it's a lost tradition, it's not something Western 21st century desire to suddenly go and get this female scholarship going. It's not a new thing. It's reclaiming something from the past. So I know that might seem a bit irrelevant, but that's my first point. And then my second point is if a young woman feels inspired, I would suggest the first thing would also to know some of the biographies of our first female companions, the Sahabiyat. Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her. And she was known to narrate many fatwa. And then to look at, there are schools where you can go and learn the Arabic, the recitation, and then the tafsir. Take it as far as you can. Just be the pioneer of Canada. but know that you're not inventing something. It's not a bid'ah, it's not an innovation, it's a reclaiming.
So I think Dr. Kathy covered off most of the main things here, and I know we're a bit short on time. Let me just add one thing very quickly. We're quite lucky now with the internet and with smartphones and all of this sort of thing that it's much easier than in the past to connect with women who are involved in scholarship or who have Islamic knowledge. So take advantage of this. In terms of the recitation of the Quran specifically, there's actually a new app out called Qari'ah, which is specifically women reciters of the Quran. So something like this, if that's the direction you want to go and you're female and you're looking for role models, downloading an app like that and engaging with people virtually if you can't find them, in your own masjid or community is a great start. Mm-hmm.
Jazakallah khair. This has been wonderful. I know those last messages about for our sisters, and then messages that are universal about finding peace with the Quran, finding forgiveness, and acting on the messages of the Quran. Thank you so much to Dr. Kathy Bullock and Dr. Julie Lowe for taking the time to be here with us today. It has been a pleasure, and I know that the people in the audience, as well as myself, have learned a lot. So thank you. We will now move on to sort of close off our event with announcements. So IIT has been bringing you a variety of programs online since the start of COVID-19. We're continuing to do so. As we enter the last week of Ramadan, our programs include Resilient Hour on Mondays and Wednesdays, about 45 minutes before iftar, our Saturday evening lecture starting approximately 1 hour before Maghrib, and online pre-recorded Ramadan moments by our scholars uploaded daily. Our website also has content on fasting, zakat, and zakat al-fitr. Please continue to check islam.ca and our Facebook page for updates on programs and events. And while you are there, please donate to IIT. It is simple and secure to do so online. Please remember as well to pay your zakat al-fitr and fidya as the end of Ramadan approaches. Zakat al-fitr is $10 per person in your household, payable before Eid, and fidya is also $10 for a day when you are unable to fast. Our 27th night program and fundraising will be held on Wednesday night with distribution of sweets after. Please join us. And our qaris will complete the Quran on Saturday night with a special dua. Eid al-Fitr is on Monday, May 2nd at 9:00 a.m. Details will be posted on our website. Once again, Jazakallah khair for the time that our speakers took with us today, and we will see everybody again on Wednesday. Inshallah, we will have another prominent Canadian Muslim scholar, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, addressing us. I believe for the remainder of the time until the adhan for iftar, we may have a Quranic recitation. And thank you so much to everybody for taking the time to join us for another Resilient Hour.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذين يوفون بعهد الله ولا ينقضون الميثاق والذين يصلون ما أمر الله به أن يوصل ويخشون ربهم ويخافون سوء الحساب والذين صبروا ابتغاء وجه ربهم وأقاموا الصلاة وأنفقوا مما رزقناهم سرا وعلانية ويدرؤون بالحسنة السيئة أولئك لهم عقبى الدار جنات عدن يدخلونها ومن صلح من آبائهم وأزواجهم وذرياتهم والملائكة يدخلون عليهم من كل باب سلام عليكم بما صبرتم فنعم عقبى الدار. والذين ينقضون عهد الله من بعد ميثاقه ويقطعون ما أمر الله به أن يوصل ويفسدون في الأرض أولئك هم اللعنة ولهم سوء الدار. الله يبسط الرزق لمن يشاء ويقدر وفرحوا بالحياة الدنيا وما الحياة الدنيا في الآخرة إلا متاع. ويقول الذين كفروا لولا أنزل عليه آية من ربه قل إن الله يضل من يشاء ويهدي إليه من أناب. الذين آمنوا وتطمئن قلوبهم بذكر الله ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب. صدق الله العظيم. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.